So one of the fundamental things about this is while I'll focus on reducing friction, there is also an important reason to increase friction as well. And I'm going to touch on that because it is important to help customers achieve better outcomes while increasing friction. But we have to be careful not to veer into what's classified as sludge. And this is essentially bringing in friction in a way that impedes customers from carrying out behavior that they want to carry out or is actually in their best interests. So fundamentally, when I talk about friction, I'm going to give a bit of a meta definition. So if friction was to describe itself, it would be that friction is anything that impedes essentially a customer, a human being, one of us, from either buying, engaging, or taking value out of a product, a service, or experience. Now, one of the things with this is actually a pretty limiting definition to some extent, but it's a good starting point, and I want to bring this back up as I talk through a bit of a story of my airport journey that I had about 4 weeks ago. But there's another factor to this as well, which is essentially there's some psychological components which are going to be really important when we actually talk through that story because they're so important to understanding how we experience friction. So firstly, one of the core things that we know is that our memory does not code duration. In fact, we have an experience every 3 seconds. That's about the amount of time it takes for us to become consciously aware of experiences. And so we record snapshots. And when we go through a journey, all that we recollect from that journey is a series of snapshots of different friction experiences, not necessarily every individual experience that we actually have. So secondary to this, every experience is not in isolation. I think that will be very familiar to us. The prior experiences, the prior friction will actually impact another set of friction that you might actually feel or experience down the line when it comes to particular journeys. Third up, not every experience in the journey is equal. As behavioral scientists, we often talk about the peak end rule. And that is when typically what we do when perceiving the entire journey, we overweight the peak of emotion in that journey and also the end of that journey as well. So we have to consider how we might be designing friction for those peak elements of our journey. And then finally, the end outcome modulates or mitigates how we feel about a particular journey. So that's a really important component. We often talk about the outcome bias, where actually the end outcome, whether positive or negative, bleeds back through our experiences that we've had across a particular journey. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just unpack something that we'll all be very familiar with, which is an airport journey, and talk through the different friction points that exist and how each one of these psychological principles is really core to that experience. But I also, when designing these slides, had a moment of introspection, and I recognized, first and foremost, that I'm not great at taking selfies. So there are not great pictures of myself, and apologies for that. They're not Instagram worthy. And secondary, I am no actor. So while I try and convey emotion through my face as I was taking these selfies, I've also written on the slides so that everybody can see exactly what they are. So let me talk about my journey. So this is back about 4 weeks ago, so talking back in time, and I was just going up to see my brother. So this is holiday time for me. He lives up in Sunshine Coast. I was getting an opportunity to go and see family, go and see my nieces, and I arrived at Melbourne Airport. Super excited. That's me, that's my excited face. I've written it up there just in case you don't understand the state of mind. I'm really excited, T2, and as soon as I walk through those doors, I get an element of friction. So here we have a set of cues to the check-in, and it's not a major pain point. It's kind of a small amount of irritation, a small amount of friction, and I was completely okay with that. But what is really interesting when telling the story is this is a snapshot. I haven't talked about packing my bags and the annoyance of packing my bags. I haven't talked about the journey there and the Uber and the traffic that exists. And to be honest with you, I don't remember any of those individuals' experiences. I call out specific things, and that's how we all remember. We remember specific snapshots, and that differs by each different customer depending on the experiences that they have. And so the second snapshot that existed, experiences like this at security checkouts will all be very familiar to us. And essentially this was dark, dingy. This is Melbourne Airport again, and here I hit my second queue. But what's important here is not only did I have to queue initially to get through check-ins, I had a queue at the cafe, and then I had now a third queue here. And what's could have been a minor friction point, a minor pain point of mine, is actually compounded by the fact that I had previous friction. which is actually really interesting from a survey perspective, because often we ask questions in isolation of each individual experience, not necessarily looking at the compound impact of friction across a variety of different experiences across the journey. So shifted, and I'm going to fast forward massively now. I'm not going to talk about the airline journey at all. I jumped on the airline, the staff were okay, the food was terrible as it always is, and I reached Sunshine Airport. Baggage collection, this is a really peak component in this journey. It's a really emotive component, and it actually bleeds across all of the experiences of friction I had. So what we find is this is not an equal part. Well, this is a peak part in that journey. And so that's a really important component to consider when designing friction into particular journeys that we actually have. Interestingly here, I had multiple emotions. I was frustrated, I was a little bit tired from jumping off the plane, but also slightly excited. And the baggage was stopping me from going outside the airport, seeing my brother and seeing my nieces. So that's the complex series of emotions that I was feeling, which was actually causing me to have that kind of peak emotion and overweight this particular piece of friction. But after all that, I was out Sunshine Coast, spent a week with my family, and it was great. And so that was the outcome. And that outcome, again, comes back and bleeds across my memory or recollection of every part of the friction that actually exists. And this is really important because if you ask me, would I do this all again? Would I go through the friction in the airport to get up to Sunshine Coast? Absolutely. There is no doubt that I would do that. And there is, I guess, no other choices. And so we don't live in a world, certainly when it comes to airports, where you have identical airports side by side, one with potentially less friction and one with potentially more friction. And so I would go through all that again just to be able to see my brother and my family, and irrespective of the amount of friction that we actually face. Now, I'm going to put a pin in that because things are changing, and I say it doesn't exist at the moment. This hypothetical scenario will soon exist in Sydney. So let's unpack friction a little bit more and talk about the psychology of friction. The first thing to note is that cognitive friction talks a lot about the amount of effort or the effort that we have to go through in regards to information processing to complete a task or when we experience a piece of friction or even a journey. And when we come to designing better experiences, there's three fundamental ways that we often think about these friction points. The first is sensory, so what is all of the information that exists around us? How do we process that information, both visual and tactile? Evaluative, so how do we make decisions? How do we use cues in the environment to make better decisions? How much information do we need to store in working memory? And storage. Storage is how we codify or characterize information in our own brains. And each one of those components can lead to greater levels of friction or be reduced depending on what you're trying to design. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about each of those in a little bit more detail. Sensory information is all around us. And we process 11 million pieces of information every single second, 46 of which we're consciously aware. So all of this information that comes, let's just talk visually for the moment, your brain is just discarding it, saying it's not necessarily important. And if I was to take an example, on the top left-hand here, if you look up at the corner, in the very far end of the room, that has never had more eyeballs on it at any other point in time, except for potentially the person that built this place. Because you have discarded that information. It is unimportant. Human beings do not look around their environments. The only humans that kind of do that are babies, and they look at these random things, and they don't necessarily have worked out what's important at this point in time. So when it comes to thinking about design and the sensory design component, I'm going to take a classic example. Now, I've chosen bonbons or crackers, depending on where you're from, because I think most of you necessarily won't be familiar with this category. I absolutely love Christmas in July, so it's one of my favorite times of the year. And so I have spent many a year looking at different crackers. And so I am quite familiar with this, but hopefully you're not. So imagine this. Imagine going into this shop and making a choice. You're faced with a lot of visual information, and in reality, all you can see here is colors and sizes. There's no discernible cues in the information that you're receiving to make a good choice. Now, you may know crackers and you may see a color that you particularly like, but you can't see price at this point in time. You can't work out what gifts are in each of these. Are they good? Are they bad? You can't work out what jokes are in these. Are those good? Are those bad? Spoiler alert, jokes are always really bad. So without getting closer, you'll have a really difficult choice to make in this particular scenario. And without categorizing it or actually chunking it into particular sectors with discernible cues, it makes it really difficult for people to make choices. It increases the friction in choice. There's even no brands. It is one brand, which also makes it very difficult. I love this poster. So this is 2015. This is any death metal fans in the audience? No, didn't expect so. This is 2015 Oakland Death Fest 2, and this is a real poster that exists. So Cattle Decapitation were playing, No Zodiac Origin were playing, and Party Cannon were playing. And it makes it so easy to stand out from the crowd when Party Cannon do something entirely different. So visually, it's very, very easy to be able to see that particular one. We often call that the von Restorff effect. Here, I've brought up pretty much a massive chunk of text. And you can read it. It's a bit difficult to read, but we can design little aspects to make it slightly easier. Just by adding a little bit of bold context to each of the individual words, you can help the brain to naturally fill some of the visual components to this and to make things a lot easier for the brain. So simple little design factors can help from a sensory perspective. So let's talk about evaluation. And evaluation often is the talk of choice, and too many choices means paralysis. So at the top here, if you had these series of ice creams, so we've got 8 different ice creams, let's say you don't necessarily know the flavors, you're working off just the colors, it's actually quite difficult to make that choice. So what would we want to do if we want to reduce the burden on the evaluation processes in our working memory? We can do a number of things from a choice architecture perspective. We can simply reduce the choices, which may not necessarily be in the best interest of the customers. We can provide more discernible cues. We can help people categorize or codify these components so that actually they can make better choices. We can actually ask them in a decision tree type thing to make evaluations side by side. And in fact, people are typically good at making evaluations one against another rather than trying to do things all at the same time. Alternatively, and this is what I personally do for a lot of time, it is much easier to get rid of the things that you don't like than it is to find the things that you do like. And so by removing those set of choices, it can make things a lot quicker to make a better decision. This is a really interesting one. So people often talk about uncertainty, and there's what we classify as an uncertainty tax. And this is the amount that we devalue things that are uncertain. And so what do I mean by this? I'll give you a bit of a context or an example. Let's say you were flying to Perth and you had 2 accommodation options. You're looking on the websites. And you have one hotel that has pretty bang average rooms. You'll be happy with them, but there's nothing spectacular about them. So Hotel A. And then you've got Hotel B, and they've just done some renovations, and they've got some incredible rooms. And then they've got some rooms that are not necessarily as good. So a bit dilapidated, they haven't finished off the refurb. What is interesting is what we're seeing through a series of experiments is when you have that really good and slightly bad element, and you know that you're going to go to that hotel, but you're uncertain on what you're going to get, it doesn't average out. You don't suddenly go, okay, great rooms and bad rooms, that just works out as an average. So the willingness to pay or the value that people place on it halves. So people, rather than averaging out, they devalue it by around 50%. Now that changes by context, but scientists have shown around 50% the devaluing of the willingness to pay when there's a level of uncertainty. Let's talk a little about storage. So this is the codification or categorization of information. And typically, it's a pretty easy, simple example here. Anything that is new requires new schemas to be built, and therefore a greater level of effort that's required. New stimuli, new environments, new topics. This is a good example. This is a V model from engineering. Now, I suspect there's limited engineers in this room. You probably won't walk away from this talk remembering anything about this V model. And that's completely okay, because what I'd be asking you to do is to start to build new memory structures because it's unfamiliar to you. And so that's effort that is required. You have to engage in a more frequent, harder way to be able to start to remember things that are unfamiliar. So we can design around that. And a more familiar example is lower carb buns. Of 7 grams of carbs in these buns, but again, that's not necessarily a language that we would use typically. So we can reframe that language into something that we're much more familiar and much more like to codify in our brains. 7 grams of carbs is about the equivalent of 2 pieces of lettuce. So that actually helps us to codify and store that piece of information. So reframing is a really important process to help with the storage of information. But why do we all do this? And this is actually some work that was done by Sonia Song, who works at Harvard. And this focuses on why we would want to reduce friction when it comes to engaging in social media posts. And so what she found was individuals were 3 times more likely to click on a post that had illustrations alongside the words. She found typically when there was a word breaking, it was 60% more seen. And also, alongside that, any decrease in syllables increased the level of engagement, whether that be clicks, likes, shares. And so instantly from a kind of social media perspective, we can see the role of reducing friction. Here's another example by Bettinger, who essentially ran a number of experiments, behavioral science experiments, that looked at pre-populating forms. So that's one of the biggest friction points that exist in healthcare, in education, and taxes. People don't want to fill out the forms, and it impedes them from carrying out a behavior, whether that be applying for financial gain in this particular study or doing something else. And so what they did was they pre-populated these forms, and they found that it increased the numbers of people that gained financial aid and ended up in college. So you can see how by reducing that friction, they have led to a greater level of engagement in college education. I've talked a lot about reducing friction, but also there's a role for increasing friction. So here on the left-hand, on your left-hand side, this is ANZ. So you go and you choose a credit card, and you select that credit card, and then you click next, you apply for the application, and this pops up, which is really, really good. So essentially, they're asking you why you have chosen that credit card, and you can say it may be due to a lower annual fee, or maybe actually you want to focus on reducing transaction fees when it comes to international, or maybe you want the rewards. But by adding this extra level of friction, what you're doing is you're creating a mental speed bump and checking this is exactly what they want. And so rather than just kind of choosing credit cards that are not necessarily right for people, you're actually trying to introduce friction to help them make better choices. And this is whether on your phone you're deleting contacts, or alternatively in this case, a CRM system. This is an extra piece of friction to reduce error. So delete 2 contacts, and then you have to type in the specific number. So reducing friction can actually be really good to help people make better choices. Simultaneously, we often talk about sludge, and sludge is essentially whether it's friction or other behavioral principles. It's when we use those, or companies use those, to create behaviors that are not necessarily in the best interest of the customers. And here, in this example, we have Disney Plus. It doesn't just relate to Disney Plus, it has pretty much across the board when it comes to subscriptions. If you want to get rid of this subscription and you access it via the phone, you'll see very small at the top there, they tell you have to go to the website. However, just underneath that, what you'll be able to see is to switch to an annual and save over 15%, an annual fee subscription then made it far more easy. You just click the switch button. So they have created a reduction in friction to get that annual fee, but increase the friction to stop you from actually stopping that subscription. And this is also a really good example. So this is for New Balance Athletics, and many of you will be very familiar with the check box or not check box when it comes to receiving additional follow-up emails. So I'm just going to read the wording on here. We'd love to send you emails with offers and new products from New Balance Athletics, but if you do not wish to receive these updates, please tick this box. So they specifically twisted it around so it increased friction so that people are less likely to check the box. So sludging is, it could be an entire topic on itself, but it is a big problem. So I'm just going to go back to this airport experience and talk a little bit about the hypothetical scenario that I discussed at the beginning. Things are changing in Sydney, and this is no longer a hypothetical scenario. In 2025, Western Sydney Airport is going to be built. And Western Sydney Airport is essentially an absolutely massive endeavour. About $11 billion is being invested into Western Sydney Airport, and it gives you options. And some of the work that we've been doing with Western Sydney Airport is to say, well, how can we design these experiences? What is the frictionless experiences that are going to attract individuals to select and choose to use Western Sydney Airport over alternatives or other alternatives in Western Sydney Airport? And so from a frictionless perspective or reducing friction, we can start to think about how do we design in facial ID recognition to remove queues? How can we design a much better dynamic baggage system so that you literally can walk out of the airport and leave your bags and then come back at a later date and pick up your bags? How can you walk through security checks and not have to take out your laptop, which is the most annoying thing ever? So simplify the entire process, every single aspect, reduce the friction so that ultimately you'll come to Western Sydney Airport and have a much better experience on that journey. So look out for that. That is a couple of years off, and we're super excited to be seeing how we can design those frictionless experiences. So just want to finish up now and just kind of summarize, I guess, where I got to with this. There are three kind of core design elements that are really important to focus on. There's a sensory side of things, there's an evaluation side of things, and there's that storage side of things, which is the kind of categorization of information. And finally, I'm just going to finish up with a quote. And we do a lot of friction audits, and I find that clients typically like this quote because it summarizes everything that we often talk about. And that is, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. And that was said by Herbert Simon. And it kind of summarizes that you can give people lots of information, lots of choice, but actually it doesn't necessarily always help them. So I'm going to finish up there and just say thank you, everybody, and pass it over to the next speaker.